Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be giving a talk on dynamic storytelling and designing player choices that matter in Wildermyth. So first things first, my name is Patrick Belanger. I am one of the programmers on the Wildermyth team. I graduated with my MFA at UConn in 2018. Wildermyth had some pretty good critical reception. We launched it in 2021 on Steam and itch.io. The design intent of Wildermyth, the most important parts for us are generating compelling characters and inviting the player to really care about them. And we do that largely with choices. So what makes a choice matter? When a player makes a choice in a game, there are a couple different things that happen. First of all, or sometimes there are a couple different things that happen. There are immediate effects, so those can be things like combat buffs or items that they get, which are not quite as impactful. We usually don't think of those as choices that matter if you get +1 speed on a mission. But they're very easy to see. They're very visual. You can see a character got an item or something like that. And then there are future effects that choices can have. So these can be changes in relationships. These can be story arcs that happen if you make one choice and it impacts choices that you can make later on. And these are really the types of choices that we think of as mattering in a game, but also they can be much harder to see. So a couple examples right here, Walking Dead and Life is Strange. Both of these, they have some of these longer-term future effects in some of their choices, and they very clearly state to the player that it's going to have choices by saying that someone will remember that, or choose carefully, this action is going to have consequences, which sometimes can be very useful for just letting the player know that something's going to have consequences, but also it can feel sort of in your face, and then if it doesn't pan out later, if the player doesn't see that choice, it can feel like they were lied to, so you want to be very careful with player trust there. But so other than explicitly stating that something is important, how do you show the player that something's important? So a couple things about making choices and what makes a choice feel good. First of all, you don't want to make any choices obviously better than other choices, because easy choices are boring. If you have a choice and there is only one correct answer, then is it really a choice? So there are a lot of ways that you can make choices not have an obvious answer. So you can have risk versus reward. In a lot of our choices in Wildermyth, we'll have one choice that is kind of very easy and you know that only one thing will happen, but then some choices will have percentages on it. So there's a chance that you might fail in some of these other choices. So you're taking that risk. For other ones, there's a benefit and drawback to each choice. So for example, in one event, your character can get a fire transformation, and while that sounds very cool, there's also a drawback of when you transform one of your arms into a firearm, then you can no longer hold two-handed weapons. So doing things like that where one of the choices is very cool, but maybe impacts other parts of gameplay that you might not always want to engage with. Other things about choices, you want to be sure that they're distinct, understandable, and reasonable. So making them distinct, if you have two choices, one of them says, all right, and the other says, yeah, that's not interesting. It doesn't matter which one you choose. Sometimes it can still be at least a little interesting if they have slightly different dialogues that happen afterwards, and that can still be a fun, just like, oh, look, I made a choice and it referenced it. But most of the time, it's not a choice that really matters. And it's okay to have choices that don't matter in your game too, but they're not the ones players care about that often. Making it understandable, a player can't make a choice if they don't know what they're choosing. So it's okay if sometimes those choices are a little nebulous, so they're not entirely sure what the outcome is going to be. But if you have a dialogue option that says one thing, and you click it and the character says something entirely different that you weren't expecting, the player is going to feel like they didn't even make the choice. They made a choice and something else happened. So you want to be sure the player has at least some idea of what their choice is going to do. And make sure the choices are reasonable. If you can't envision yourself ever making a certain choice, it's probably not a good choice. So as an example here, we have an event that we pretty recently revised in Wildermyth about a hero who is reconciling with a family member who they have a not great relationship with. And originally, the two choices that we had there were, one of them is like, oh, I'm through with them, I'm done. And the other was, well, maybe I was a little harsh. And in this one, obviously, the second choice here is the correct one, because just being like, oh, like the character seems angry here, and it seems like they don't care about their parent, and like, it just didn't really feel like much of a choice. And even the outcome of that choice back then was just sort of a sad outcome. And it was like, oh, okay. So we revised that event and made it so that instead, it has the same sort of outcomes, where in one of them, you are not listening to your parent who you have a bad relationship, and one of them you are. But we made it much more subtle. We made it much more like there are a lot of relationships where you have given the other person a lot of chances throughout your life, and you've given them too many, and you know that things are just never going to work out. And that is something that happens in real life, and we want to reflect that. So making it so that the choice to not reconcile with your parent is something that still feels good, that feels like something that you could do. Both of these, listening or not listening, is a choice that should feel good. So a little bit of background on Wildermyth's procedural storytelling. So Wildermyth is a game that is very procedural. It has procedural events. It has procedurally generated characters. And it has a lot of campaigns that are mostly procedural. So a lot of randomness going on. And this is very important to the storytelling in a lot of ways. So starting out, for our procedural events, the way that we usually refer to them is a library of plays. So each event is a play. Events happen kind of randomly throughout a campaign. And each event has a cast of characters that it needs. So roles have requirements and scoring functions. So sometimes these are based off of personalities. Sometimes they're based off of characteristics the hero has. So sometimes you might have an event that only happens if you have a hero who is very romantic, or a hero who has a certain weapon, or a hero who has a certain relationship with another character. Yep, roles are matched in order, so it kind of just is like, all right, do we have a character who has this weapon? Yes, well, we also need a character who has this relationship, check that. And then once we have a list of all of our events that we can do, we pick one of them randomly, and actors bring their identities and personalities to the role. So beyond just picking a random event that has the types of characters we want, we also infuse that event with different parts of that character's personality. So we have splits in the dialogue where a character will say a different thing depending on what personality they are or what relationship they're in, etc. And having all these things together, having layers, is what makes things really feel good. So just as an example, this is what our editor looks like in-game. So you can see over here is where all of the targets are. So there's a couple boilerplate things here. We say like, oh, this event only happens if it's chapter 2 or later. But then we get to some of the targets. So you can see target is one hero that we're requiring, and we're saying, all right, this hero needs to be like either a healer, a hothead, a leader, a romantic, or a poet. Like these are the types of characters that this event makes sense for. And we also want to be sure that this character is eligible for the fire theme. And so this can just mean like, oh, there are transformations in this game, and some transformations don't mix together, or if they're not able to get it for whatever reason. So just checking to make sure all those things work. And then after choosing that target, if we get a hero who can do that, we move on to the next one. We're like, all right, now we have volunteer, and ideally we want to pick someone who is either a family member with that first character or has some sort of relationship with that character. And some of these are optional as well, so we're not requiring the other hero to have that relationship, but we're saying if they do have this relationship, it'll make this event more impactful, so look for it. And then another hero that has a certain relationship with the hero. And then this is how the writing looks. So there is a lot of text. And I'm going to, I think my next slide has some more close-ups on this, but you can see here that some of these things have splits. So you can say this says target.healer/hothead/leader, etc. And this is us just, we write different things for all of the different personalities that that person could have. And that's true of things other than heroes as well. So Like up here, we are checking what the environment of the overland is like. So we say something different if we're in a swamp versus if we're in a broadleaf forest. And you can see this is what the actual comic looks like. So we've just got some heroes who were randomly generated, and they're saying the things. And so what does this have to do with choices? So all of this dynamic stuff, all of these things that come together, the way that choices have weight and impact is how they affect the future. And the more ways that we can reference choices that have been made in the past, the more impact those choices are going to have. So I talked about some of this already, but we add a lot of variations based on personality. So whether they're romantic or whether they're bookish or snarky. We add variations based on relationship, whether that means romantic relationships or rivalries or family relationships. Based on class, so whether you're a warrior or a hunter or a mystic, a magic user. Based on transformations, and I keep bringing up transformations. I'm going to get into it more because transformations are fun. And also past events, so things that have happened previously, if that has some impact on something that is happening now. And just as an example that I've put here, the very first choice that we present the player with is, what kind of relationship does this hero have with this other hero? The player starts out by picking a party of 3 characters, and we throw them into the game, and then we're like, all right, these 2 characters, how do they feel about each other? And that gives the player a lot of agency right off the start, letting them decide how these 2 characters interact. You're just like, right off the bat, you want to give them a choice that feels very important, and relationships do feel very important. So personalities. When giving heroes personalities in a game, there are a couple things that we've learned throughout making Wildermyth. One of them, so obviously you want to give personalities a consistent-ish voice. You want to make it so that with procedurally generated characters, throughout the campaign, it feels like this character is an individual. You can hear them say something and you're like, yeah, I understand that that character would say something like that. And to get this effect, you mostly want to focus on 1 or 2 traits. So you can see over here, these are all of the different personality traits that all of our heroes have, and they have a number associated with it. And you can see that poet and healer are the 2 highest, and then after that, it's all kind of like, eh. And that's also how we refer to them. So this is the compassionate poet, compassionate being healer and poet being poet. We only really focused, for the most part, on the top 2 personality stats in Wildermyth. And that's because any more than that, and the player has trouble remembering it. It's like if you try to insert every, like, oh, the hero is just like a little tiny bit of a coward, the player doesn't care about that. It's not really the part of the personality that we're looking for. So also don't go overboard. Don't make caricatures, especially with dynamically generated text. If you do something way too poetic or snarky, or like if you try to make someone greedy say like, oh, I'm going to steal the thing every time that you have a split, then any time that you're not saying that, it's going to feel out of place. So you want it to be subtle, but different enough that players can put together like, oh yeah, this greedy person likes stuff. So you can see in this example, the hero is just saying, I'm not standing out here and ruining my gear, because they care about stuff. And you can see, so these are just all of the different variations of text for this panel up here. Heroes are standing out in the rain thinking of going into a cave, and depending on what type of personality they are, they'll say different things. So here is a close-up of the way this works, just so it's a little easier to see. So again, we have a split up here based off of the personality traits, and then for each of those, a line is handwritten. So that's how a lot of our dynamic things work. Everything is handwritten by our writers, who are absolutely phenomenal. There's so much text in this game. And there are so many things like this where we have one line, we want to say one sort of thing, and we'll say it in like 12 different ways. So transformations. I've mentioned them a couple of times. What are they? How do they work? Why are they great? So Transformations are visually distinct and thus easy to remember. So when you're making choices, all of our transformations are, for the most part, there might be some that are slightly unknown, but they are mostly opt-in. So if you can get a transformation, it's pretty clear that something very important is going to happen to your character, and sometimes it'll explicitly say a transformation is going to happen. Transformations are great for remembering choices because they are so visually distinct. When you go further into a campaign, every time you see that character, you're going to be reminded of that choice you made. Every time the character does something, you can be like, oh, ha, that's the character with the wolf head. I remember when that wolf head happened. That was a great choice that I made. And so you don't need to remember that a certain event happened because it is right in your face. You're seeing it every time you see the character. Another important thing about transformations is that they affect combat. So things that have a mechanical impact in the game also influence how important a choice feels. So if you make a choice and it has an impact on the rest of the gameplay, that feels very good. And just as another example here, so here's an event that only happens if you have a crowhead. And we have a lot of events like that where if you have a certain transformation, this event can happen, and it's very clear what's going on here. The person with the crow head is looking up and is like, oh, there are crows, and I can understand crows, and the player doesn't have to be like, why is this happening? Because they see the crow head, they remember the choice they made. And going back to visual distinction and also affecting combat, so all of the gear in our game is visually represented on characters. So as heroes go through several chapters of fights and getting gear, they will look cooler and cooler, which looking cool is very important. But also, it is just a reminder of all the choices you've made. And getting gear is like a very small choice most of the time. So you'll get some pauldrons or you'll get a belt and you'll be like, oh, cool, belt. And you put it on and then you kind of forget about it. But it's still there. It still has impact. It still feels like you have made a difference in the way the character is presenting. And this happens in a lot of other games. So thinking of games like Risk of Rain 2, which is a roguelike game, and there's not really any story to it or anything, for the most part. But whenever you get items, it shows those items on your hero, so you can see this hero being more and more decked out with things. That is just a form of small storytelling where, oh, look, I can remember getting all these things because here they all are on my character. Likewise, in a game like Hades, if you have a bow, you have your standard arrow, but then if you get it blessed by Aphrodite, then it has a heart on it. And every time you shoot that bow, you are reminded of that choice that you made, where you're like, oh yeah, I met Aphrodite and she blessed my bow, and now it's got little hearts on it. So in addition to impacting the actual functional mechanics of the game, it influences the visuals so that you can see and are reminded of that choice you made. So again, I've been talking about this, but having choices affect gameplay mechanics is very important. So our transformations do that, our gear, so I had mentioned that gear is maybe not always that impactful, but it can be with special weapons. If you have weapons that are tied to specific events that you can only get in certain ways, that is a reminder of that story that happened, ones that are very special. Relationship combat buffs. So one of the things we do is for all of the relationships, for lovers or rivals or friends, all of those affect combat. So you can see right here, it says, oh yeah, watch this, which is if a character who has a rival gets a critical hit on another enemy, then the other character, their rival, gets a bonus to critical hit chance, where it's like, oh, yeah, well, you hit them, well, I'm going to hit them even harder, and it's kind of like a one-up. And we have similar things for lovers. There's Lover's Vengeance, which is any enemy that attacks your lover has the lover of that character does extra damage to that enemy. Friends who stand next to each other have a higher block chance. There are several things like that. So making relationships not only be important in the types of events that show up for them and the ways that they talk to each other, but also making them important in actual combat. And then we've also got mortal choices, which are a very important part of our game. So we try to handle failure and death in a way that is different, I guess. I don't. So when you lose all of your health in combat in Wildermyth, you are presented with a choice of what you want to do, whether you want to fall back and sometimes lose an arm or a leg and replace it with a hook arm or a peg leg, or whether you want to go out heroically and give some sort of buff to the group or a specific character. And so this specific choice here is for if you have a character die who has a lover nearby, and there's just a little interaction between them that is like, hey, these characters are lovers, and one of them really cares about the other one. How do you want to handle this? If you make that choice to have one of them sacrifice themselves for the good of the group, then that's a very powerful choice. Most of the time, players don't because it's very sad, but it feels important. So I've been talking a lot about choices, but the other thing that all of this, something you may have realized, is that not all of these things really feel like choices per se. So there's a slight difference between choices versus dynamic things that have happened to the player. But the way that they impact the player experience is often very similar. So in real life, our choices aren't the only thing that impact the world. Everyone else's choices and the universe's choices, things that just happen, also impact the world. And so in addition to acknowledging the player's explicit choices, you want to acknowledge other things that have happened, whether that's enemies or places or events the player has seen, whether it's ways that a character has died or been injured, whether it's relationships, so friends or lovers or rivals, whether that's who's in the party or how many people are in the party. So you can see here's one event where it's just slightly different based on if you have a full party, or if you only have one hero left because everyone else died in combat, then you kind of want to acknowledge that. You want to be like, yep, I'm the only hero here, because that's an important story moment. Like, they care about their friends, and even if you don't, like, the more text you want to write, obviously, the longer it takes. So even acknowledging that just with one line where you're like, it's just me now, that gives the player that feeling of, oh, yeah, they're alone. So thinking more on this, games a lot of the time do this, so if you think about any quest that you do, where you can do it at any time, oftentimes if you talk to a quest giver and you have already completed the quest, it will have different dialogue than if you haven't completed the quest yet. Because if you go up to a hero with the shield of power, and then the NPC says, oh, can you find me the shield of power? And then you click off of them and you click on them again, and they're like, oh, you found it, good job. That's weird. Yeah. Feels weird. So if you go up to them instead and they're like, oh, look, you already found the shield of power. That's cool. Then the player's like, oh, yeah, I did already find it. I'm glad that you noticed that I found it before you even asked me for it. You want to acknowledge things that are happening. You want to acknowledge the world of the game. So a lot of the time that just means give a satisfying answer to what happens if I do this weird thing. If the player tries to do something like that, where they go up to a quest giver like already having completed the quest. Or so in Undertale, there are so many examples of this in Undertale. Undertale is so dynamic and acknowledges so many of the weird things you can do, but this is just one example where if you try to buy a hot dog and your inventory is full, the NPC will just be like, oh, well, your inventory is full, so I'm just going to put it on your head instead. And you can do that up to 30 times, and you can see this character just has a stack of hot dogs on their head. Which, why would you do that? It's absolutely absurd, but it answers the question. If the player is like, what happens if I try to buy something and my inventory is full? They have an interesting answer to that question, and the player is thrilled. It's a thrilling thing when you try this weird, where you're like, oh, they probably just don't let you do it, and then they do, and it's funny. There are a lot of other examples of this in Undertale, like at the very beginning of the game, one of the characters tells you to wait for them, and it is expected that you won't actually wait for them and that you will continue playing the game. But if you do wait around for 15, 20 minutes, that character will continue to call you, and you will hear this story of a dog distracting them and taking away things that they're trying to get, and that's why it's taking them so long, and it's just very For the few players that do that, it feels incredibly good. In Hades, talking about Hades again, Hades is fantastic. Every time you die, it references something. It references the thing that killed you. Hades has a lot of places where they reference things that have happened when characters are speaking. They will reference other things that your character knows or has seen. It's very good at doing that. And again, so that's not really a choice per se. To die via a wretched thug, obviously you didn't choose to die to that enemy, but the fact that the game is acknowledging that you died to it makes you feel much more invested in it. So when should we add dynamic text? Always, every time. But more realistically, because we don't have infinite dev time, you want to add it in places where it just makes sense or where it wouldn't make sense to not reference it. So one of these cases, so I say at the bottom, we take a lot of liberties here. We added parent-child relationships sort of late into the game. And in most places in the game, things would just reference heroes via name. And so we would have a hero that would be like, oh, good job, Ansia, and it's their mother. And it's like, well, why are you calling your mother by her first name? And so we've since then added a lot of cases where we do reference them specifically as mom or dad or parent. But we also added an event specifically for that where we were like, all right, this happens often enough that we're going to give a story reason for it and just be like, oh, here's the characters talking about the fact that sometimes they call each other on a first name basis just to kind of like explain it away a little bit and make it make a little bit more sense. Oftentimes, restricting content is a little bit easier than adding new content. So we recently had an event that we made so that it doesn't happen to heroes who have wings, because if the hero gets stuck in a pit and they have wings, it feels kind of weird. They're like, well, why can't they just fly out? And you want to really try not to break the world that the player is imagining here. You want to try not to do things that don't make sense to the player. So sometimes the easiest way to do that, rather than, like, you could theoretically explain it away as well. You could be like, oh, my wings don't let me fly up, or you could make it so that a different thing happens, but that can be harder. Sometimes it's better to just, it is better to have content that doesn't work with a certain configuration of choices than content that breaks the player's expectations of the game. Here's another case of something that only happens in certain cases. So we've got an event where you encounter this ice creature, this ice being, and these first two choices are always there, where you're either reacting with force or talking them down. But then there's a third choice that we only include if you have a hero that has a firearm, where you're like, okay, well, if you don't listen to me, I'll melt you. And that's another case where it makes sense, where you're like, oh, well, you've got an ice thing and you've got a fire hero, why wouldn't you use that? And not having that choice there would feel a little bit weird. It wouldn't feel too weird. It wouldn't be at the point of breaking the player's expectations. But oftentimes when players go into this situation, they'll be like, oh, well, I've got a fire hero, so I could probably melt that person. And then when they get the choice, then that choice is actually one of the options. They're like, oh, cool. And also adding dynamic text in places where it's unexpected and fun. So just creating little moments where things that have happened to you are referenced. So we've got this event up in the top right-hand corner where one of the ways in which it can happen is a player will just look up and to the left and they'll see a cave and then they'll be like, oh, I want to explore this cave. But we also added a choice where if you have a certain pet with your hero, that pet will chase a squirrel up to that cave instead. And it's not necessary, but it does remind the player of the event they had in the past where they chose to get a critter. Likewise, we have something in our game called tidings, which is in between chapters of the game. There are several years of peace that pass. And during that peacetime, we just show certain things that have happened in between when the world is in danger. And those often reference choices that the players have made. So for example, we have this where it's just like, it's very silly. It's a wolf, if you have two wolf heroes and one of them is just communicating with the other. It's very simple, but it's like, hey, we recognize that you have two wolf heroes in your party, which is pretty cool, and we want to let you know that we also think it's cool. Or if you get an egg at one point in the game, like you make a choice to try and get an egg from an eagle's nest and then raise it. And during tidings, we show that that egg hatched and turned into an eagle. And we don't do much else with that. So oftentimes when players get the egg at the start, and it kind of says, oh, I'm going to grow this into a crag eagle, and then it doesn't really reference it for a while, players are kind of like, I wonder what happened to that egg. So then just having this one moment where after the chapter is over, we reference it and are like, hey, that egg turned into an eagle. That's enough to give the player a feeling of satisfaction and a feeling of completion. And it's pretty simple. Like, we didn't have to add a whole big story arc about it or anything like that. We just had this one event where you had the egg and then one event where it turned into an eagle, and that's enough to make the player feel good about that choice and like that choice had an impact. And that's pretty much it. I didn't time this out beforehand, so I wasn't actually positive how long it would take, but yeah, thank you. So yeah, I've definitely.
So you had mentioned earlier that one of the considerations was to restrict information. How does your team think about, because I know how much effort it takes to create that much dialogue. How do you decide where to gatekeep that dialogue? Like, are you okay with the fact that a player might only ever experience 30% of the game's dialogue, or maybe 50%? Like, do you expect there to be replays? Do you expect them to go through and find everything? Or what is the general experience been like?
Right. So Wildermyth, as a procedurally generated game with procedural heroes and procedural events and procedural campaigns, we expect players to play it multiple times. The base game has 5 campaigns with like sort of set story arcs, but all of the in-between events are procedural. But we expect the player to play a bunch of times, and we know that a lot of our events are very, very restrictive. So this is a conversation that we actually do have a lot, because some players go through the game for like 200 hours and they still haven't seen a certain event, but they've seen this other event like 70 times, because some events are just very easy to get and others are very hard to get. It's basically on a per event basis. We just talk about it and we're like, all right, first of all, how cool is this event? And is it really sad if players don't get it? How often do players want this event? We have some logic in there that makes it so that every time you see an event in a campaign, the chances of you seeing it in the next campaign are reduced. So that is there to help facilitate players. We want players to see all the events if possible. But sometimes if you've got an event that requires a hero with a flame arm and with a lover and with something else, and it can only happen in a swamp, then it just becomes very hard to see. And we also, there have been several occasions where we've looked at events like that and we've been like, all right, how can we make it so that more players can see this? Like, instead of requiring this for this event, can we add a split into the event that makes it so that it acknowledges the different possibilities there?
Do you have the idea for the relationship in regard to the combat scenarios that in release?
Where did we get the idea? I mean, I think just like going into the premise of Wildermyth being that things like relationships are important. So there are a lot of other things too that I haven't mentioned that are like heroes age over time, and heroes will retire, and heroes will have kids in between chapters, and like all of these things are working toward the goal of making it feel like your characters are important, getting you attached to your characters, and getting you attached to the choices that your characters have made. And having relationships have some sort of impact in combat was just one of the first things that was like, well, yeah, like relationships are powerful things and they're very compelling story elements. So we want that to impact combat. I don't know if there was any specific thing that spurred it on. I know sort of at the beginning of working on Wildermyth when I wasn't a part of the team, part of the thoughts behind it were the lead programmer and some other people were playing a lot of XCOM, and they were like, man, I really like XCOM, but I wish that I had a little bit more feelings toward these characters, and that was kind of the beginning of where that thought process started.
Intrigued me is because when I was playing the game 2 days ago, like the rival system, I was like, why would I want to make anyone like a rival of each other? And then hearing the track get it based on the rival, I was like, that's so cool. Like, so it's just really cool.
Right. So yeah, the rivalry system is a lot of players have that first initial reaction where they're like, well, why do I want rivals in my party? But it's more of a friendly rivalry. And it doesn't impact anything negatively. Like there's no like, oh, these characters hate each other, so it's a debuff. It's like, oh, these characters are kind of like, they both want to be better. And it's more about like most of the place that the relationships come out in the story are just with dialogue, and like maybe they're like a little like poking fun at each other a bit more, but it's not like heated rivalry where one of them hates the other.
What do the writers work in?
What do the writers work in? The writers work in this fancy dancy editor that I showed a couple times. Yeah, so sometimes there will be a lot of like prior to writing everything out, usually they'll put some ideas together in a Google Doc or Word doc or whatever, and then figure out what sorts of choices they want to be made and what sorts of things they're going to have to account for. But overall, this editor is, I believe, what all of our writers use at this point. We added in a whole bunch of contextual highlighting and things. So like, for example, if your mouse is in a certain place in here, then you can see that this is a darker black, whereas everything else is gray, because that's, if you put your mouse there, you can see what part of the text is that split that you're in, and it will also highlight other previous parts to kind of show what led up to it, just making it easier for the writers to parse what things are there. Because when you just have a whole bunch of left brackets and then a million different pieces of words, it can be difficult to figure out what's going on. And in addition to that, we have, so this is the setup in the game where you have all of these things together on one screen, and you can look at the comic that it's generating as you are writing that text, and you can re-roll it so that you get random heroes. Recently, we added some features to make it so that it tries to kind of auto-match those heroes to the things that it says in here. So that way you can, like, if you click on a certain part in the text, then it will change the heroes so that all the other parts of the text leading up to it are also correct, and you can see how the whole comic is going to play out.
This is a fully custom editor.
Yes. Yeah.
One follow-up question, which is, I do a lot of game writing. And so, like, this is super fascinating. And how are your writers, or are they following any particular threads? Can you sort of see a pathway? I don't know if it's, I don't do too much with procedural, but like if they wanted to see how a character's arc goes over time, would they be able to visually follow that?
Let's see. I'm not positive I'm understanding your question, but most of the time, so in Wildermyth, most of the time, most of the arcs, quote unquote, aren't very large arcs. So most of the things that happen to individual players are just future events referencing past choices without it being any serious, like, oh, this player did this thing and now they're able to do this thing. We do have some of that where, like, the one specific example I'll give is that the player can find a critter pet, and that pet likes digging things up, and then later on you can get an event where it digs up a coin that's completely useless, and then later on you get an event where there's a merchant looking for a useless coin. And there's also a secondary path to that where if you have a crow hero, in fact, that event that I showed before where the crow hero was looking at the crows can give you that coin, and the player will be like, oh, okay. Where was I going with this?
Maybe kind of similar question from a different angle. at the early stages of game creation? What was the role of the writers, and how many writers have that, have been consistently with the game? And therefore kind of have that maybe internalized from early stages?
Right. So I came onto the game after it had already been in production for a couple of years. It was already a pretty decently fleshed out thing. But we've had a number of different writers over time. I want to say we've had like maybe 3 or 4 who contributed some writing early on in the process who aren't a part of the team anymore right now. But there has been a lot of shifting in the writing over time. Like as we got closer to launch, most of the writing was done by our lead writer, Doug Austin, and Katie Austin. And we kind of tried to, like some of the writing was in slightly different styles, and as it went on and the editors got more sophisticated and being able to make more sophisticated comics, like as we added more options to those things, it kind of converged into a certain style. So we've also gone back and adjusted some of our older events because the writing has shifted over time. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think we're gonna head downstairs for our thank you ceremony. Thank you.
Thank you.